Good morning and welcome back for our second panel today. I'm Melinda Taylor. I'm on the faculty of the School of Law at the University of Texas in Austin and the academic director, one of the academic directors of the K. Bailey Hutchison Center for Energy, Law, and Business. And we're very pleased to be here today and honored to be co-hosting this with the Baker Institute. I want to thank Francisco and all of our colleagues at the Baker Institute for putting on such a lovely event today. So we have a very interesting panel discussion, I think, that will complement nicely and put some specific details and flesh around many of the issues that our first wonderful panel discussed this morning. This one features Miriam Grunstein, who's here, and you heard a little bit about Miriam this morning. She's working on a very interesting case book that delves into some specific case studies where these conflicts between indigenous communities and energy projects have arisen. And so we're going to hear some about her work and some of the very preliminary conclusions that she has reached in that regard. So the way our panel is going to work, Miriam will give her presentation, and then we have three very distinguished commenters who will make some remarks that in reaction to Miriam's case studies. We'll have some discussion among the panelists, and then, of course, would love to engage all of you in questions and comments as well. I'm not going to go into detailed, long descriptions and introductions of these folks because they're in the program, and I don't want to take too much of your time. But the discussants will proceed in the order that's in the program. So Professor Owen Anderson, who's a professor and the Distinguished Oil and Gas Scholar at the University of Texas School of Law and the K. Bailey Hutchison Center, will be the first commenter, discussant. He'll be followed by Benigna Cortez-Lees. I'm so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with me today. The former general director of Mexico's, of Chevron's Mexico program. And then Dr. Michelle Foss, who's the chief energy economist and head of the Center for Energy Economics at the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas. She's based here in Houston. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Miriam. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, following this first fantastic panel, I feel completely intimidated, especially because my friend Lourdes has lived in person the cases which I'm going to present. And also, but at any rate, I'm very happy to be here because of many reasons. As mentioned, I'm going to talk about community relations, land rights, and their effects on Mexico's investment climate during the implementation of the 2013 energy reform. First of all, I should mention that I am being sponsored to draft this case book by the Matias Romero grant, which is granted by the Ministry of Foreign Relations, Relaciones Exteriores, and Lilas Institute. And I am under the guidance and with the guidance of Dr. Michelle Foss. Thank you so much for everything. Any errors, mistakes, mishaps that my research may have is entirely my own responsibility. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the purpose of the case book. A lot was spoken about the law and about some of the consequences of not having a strong rule of law in Mexico. But I am more interested in the narrative of how the rule of law works with the dynamics of communities in Mexico. And there are two pieces of confusion that I might underscore. One thing is the acquisition of land, and another thing is social impact. They're intimately related, but they're not the same. Sometimes communities react due to land issues. Some other times communities react due to other reasons that have nothing to do with land acquisition. And the problem initially began because certain indigenous communities were paid land rights that were below market value, especially in the case of wind farms in Oaxaca. And they were civil contracts, and they were freely negotiated, and that was a practice before the energy reform. And that's when people began to run into deep trouble. Then they decided to adjust the payments for the land rights according to market value, but still, especially two communities, the one involved in Villoshow, which is a wind farm that I'm going to talk about in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, and another project called Mareñas Renovables, which Lourdes is also mentioned, refused an adjustment in their payment as a satisfactory answer to the problem. And many other issues began to be mentioned. So the issue is that you can pay the right amount for the use of land rights, and that will solve the problem, is dead wrong. People have other concerns. They become irritated. They become motivated by other incentives. So you have a well of an enormous well of complexity, because after all, we are human beings. And it is unreasonable to expect people to be reasonable. And that's what I hear all the time from the companies. It's like, they're not being reasonable. And I say, why do you expect them to be reasonable? When people have emotions, and people have lived under a scenario of corruption and under a scenario of abuse, and they're being basically motivated by stakeholders that come out of nowhere, some from Europe, some from South America, some from religious groups in Central America, some from Mexico, and they motivate them to resist. People's minds become confused. People's minds begin to make strange choices. And if we look at ourselves and the reasons why we make choices, we will see how we are sometimes very unreasonable. I can be very unreasonable at times when the right choice is pretty easy, and indigenous communities and individuals have complex psychological processes when making choices. And the purpose of this casebook is going beyond the general assumption that people make reasonable choices for reasons that may be appealing, such as fair pay or benefits. So the casebook is aimed to help people understand, within the limits of the casebook, within the scope of the casebook, why things happen and how they can be solved up to a certain point. At this point, the cases that I will be mentioning are still under legal stress. What do I mean by that? That many of the cases, or all the cases that I'm going to talk about, have been challenged before the Mexican courts. One of the cases, which was Eólica del Sur, formerly called Mareñas Renovables, was drawn by the Supreme Court so they can establish a very important precedent regarding indigenous consultation. There is already precedent regarding indigenous consultation as concerns two cases, which are not energy related, which are Wirikuta, a mining project that was suspended by the courts until proper indigenous consultation was performed, and the Acueducto Independencia, which is another project that was not that did not undergo the proper indigenous consultation process and was also suspended by the courts. Those consultation processes were repeated, and now the projects have been renewed. But, and I remember talking to Lourdes about this because she was very generous when I spoke to her about this, because one of the big challenges which I'm going to mention is that who's providing the information, and that has a great deal to do with this transparency. The NGOs and the indigenous communities. The government is very silent about it, and I understand the reasons. They don't want it to make things bigger, and the companies are completely silent about this. So the documentation available for research is provided by the NGOs and the indigenous communities. So as a researcher, because I am not a public official, I don't have a title. As Lourdes mentioned, she went to Oaxaca to visit the sites. When I wrote my first peer-reviewed article regarding the Billosho case, one of my reviewers recommended me visiting the site and interviewing the leaders. And I wrote one of the leaders, and basically my answer was, don't come here because you're at a risk of death. So I didn't interview anyone. I did interview the NGOs that were in contact with the indigenous communities, but the site was pretty hermetic when I performed the research in 2014, right before Lourdes' team performed the indigenous consultation that allowed Billosho to continue as a project. Now, I chose two cases, two involving pipelines and two involving wind farms. And why did I become so attracted to the wind farm issue? Because naively, I thought that renewable energy would have more support from the NGOs. And that was dead wrong. The NGOs completely rejected the renewable projects in the understanding that they were maybe environmentally sustainable, but they were not social sustainable. And that the new definition of sustainability has to involve social and environmental concerns. So suddenly in Mexico, green became the new black. And the press has had a lot of coverage regarding these two cases. The Mareña Renovables case, now called Eólica del Sur, which has been attracted by the Supreme Court, and Billosho, which is operating, but which has 5 constitutional challenges divided in several courts. And the other 2 pipeline cases are ATCO, and I am not going to speak about ATCO because my research hasn't been completed yet, and the Genova pipeline, which is for which there is much more information, and involved an issue of a problematic indigenous consultation problem. As I said, in order for people to understand these problems, transparency is material. Because if not, researchers are left with only one side of the story. And as Lourdes mentioned, this cannot be manichaeistic. The companies cannot be the monsters, the indigenous populations cannot be the victims. And on the other way around, indigenous populations cannot be the barbarians rejecting any form of development, and companies cannot be the saviors of development. A few months ago, there was a seminar in CIDE organized by various NGOs, and they invited various indigenous leaders, especially from the state of Mexico. And I was very preoccupied after that seminar. Why was I preoccupied? Because it was completely biased in favor of the indigenous communities. And they were religious NGOs, they were Italian NGOs, they were German NGOs that had funded this seminar. And the indigenous leader from the state of Mexico took the podium and he said, I do not want any other development other than spiritual development. And I said, whoa. I was very preoccupied when I heard that affirmation. And in the end of the seminar, I tend to be very outspoken, and that gets me often into a lot of trouble. And the preliminary results of this research have been that I've made a lot of people angry. So I hope that I can continue and successfully finish the study by trying to be objective. But I asked, okay, I honor that the only development that you want is spiritual, but what about your sons, daughters, and everybody else in this country? Should we be doomed to only aspire to have spiritual development? I am a Mexican. I am entitled to my desires of public policy, and I want some other development other than spiritual. And I was almost subject to mutiny in that particular seminar. So this is a very, very polarized issue. And it's very Manichaean. And the casebook is aimed to erase that Manichaean viewpoint that there are victims and, I don't know how you call it, victimizers in this story. Okay, this is my disclaimer. I'm a lawyer. So here it goes. When developing this casebook and when delivering this small lecture, I do not intend to support or show animosity towards any political party in Mexico. I know AMLO is in everybody's mouth. I do not intend to speak out about AMLO. AMLO is not yet the president of Mexico. These conflicts have been going on since time immemorial. They are not AMLO's responsibility at this point. Whether the government of AMLO will aggravate these conflicts is at this point highly speculative because he's not yet the president. I'm not advocating for any group, whether indigenous, private, or corporate. And certainly, while writing this research, I am not providing legal counsel. And it is, I only intend to produce research in the hopes that it will be useful for decision maker. And it's still a work in progress, so all suggestions are very much welcome. So let's talk about the cases. Let's get to the bottom line. I'm going to talk about Genova, the Guaymas El Oro Pipeline. And then I noted a quote from Adam William from Bloomberg, which really struck me. The heading of the news story was, "Before building a 400 million pipeline, make sure your neighbors are on board." And I was struck by this headline. Why was I struck by this headline? Because the first thing that jumps to me is that the communities were not consulted before building the pipeline. And that's not exactly the full story. What happened is that 7 of the communities involved in the pipeline gave a yes to the pipeline, and then 1 didn't. And this is a really strong issue. This is a really compelling issue in Mexico, because since infrastructure projects are so immense, and they overarch over on so much territory, part of which is ejido, part of which is communal, and part of which is private and even federal or public, owned by the states or the municipalities. If you have one opponent, you may have to retrace your whole project, and costs may actually skyrocket. And that's happening a lot. People are trying to avoid reaching animus communities, animus private landowners or ejido and communal or communal, and they reroute their project. What happens is that you bump into someone else. And by that time, you have solved the problem with one landowner, another landowner has a claim, because in Mexico, we have now what is called the claims industry. I heard that expression when I was working in Tabasco with a Center for Sustainability. And they say communities can get so much more out of taking things to court or negotiating with their lawyers to get money and to get benefits than to their legal claim pursuant to the law. So we really have a problem when it comes to the culture of litigation and claiming that is developing in Mexico. What's the solution for that? I still don't know. Because it's funny to say that, but the rational choice is to look for your immediate benefit. So why would you suggest to those communities or to those individuals not to claim if they're going to get more money if they file a claim rather than negotiating peacefully? And you can come up with very elegant discourses regarding development, regarding the benefits of having electricity, of energy security, of gas pipelines that are going to bring services to your home. But people in Mexico are poor and skeptical. And they have reasons to be poor and skeptical. And this government, in my view, has done very little to appease the sensation of skepticism and poverty. Just the other way around. That's why we have AMLO so high in the polls. So this issue of the previous consultation was actually confirmed by the Energy Ministry, and I couldn't quote the whole piece by Bloomberg because this presentation is already very long as it is that the bottom line is that since the Secretary of Energy, represented by Aldo Flores Quiroga, the current Undersecretary of Hydrocarbons, acknowledged that one community was against the pipeline, they are awaiting the official judicial ruling to clear the project. And these precedents will still accumulate. And the stronger the precedents, the weaker the companies will be. One of the cliches that NGOs repeat is that communities are vulnerable. No way. Communities and individuals are very powerful in Mexico, and they have many legal resources to defend themselves. And they are becoming aware that they have legal recourses. And people are training them to file things in courts. And that's when I see something that is very serious, because legislation does protect the companies, but legislation protects the indigenous. And you have one provision in the Mexican Constitution that say that energy projects are of absolute priority when concerning land use. And then you have another constitutional provision saying that indigenous rights should be respected despite all. So how do you interpret a constitution that is giving equal contradictory rights? You have overlapping contradictory rights, and that's what the Supreme Court will have to resolve. And at this point, it is very important to look at the composition of the Supreme Court. The justices are very much fond of ruling in favor of human rights, especially when they consider vulnerable groups are involved. And they just issued a ruling very recently saying that any ruling coming from the court, from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, is binding in Mexico, and that any Mexican judge will have to abide by that ruling. So it's very interesting. Okay, let's look at the Oaxaca wind farms. Some happy endings, some not. In case you didn't know the state of Oaxaca, there's a little map there with Juchitán de... Does this have a pointer? No, I turned it off. Well, it doesn't matter. You see the circle where it says Juchitán de Zaragoza. Those are mainly where the wind farms are located. Juchitán de Zaragoza happens to be one of the most fiery, proactive communities in Mexico. I taught in Oaxaca for 3 semesters at the Universidad Autónoma Benito Juárez, and it was very challenging because I had a lot of students from Juchitán who were very politicized, and it was at the time where the APO movement was conformed, which was the association of teachers that were protesting the election of the governor, who was a priest. I can't recall the name of the governor. Do you, Lourdes? There was that's when Cue lost, and I think Duarte was elected. They were protesting the election of Duarte a few years ago, and an armed group. They were armed. They had trenches, and they came particularly from the Universidad Benito Juárez de Oaxaca, and they were pretty belligerent. And the Fox government had to negotiate directly with them. Actually, one of my students was the legal counsel for the group, and he was flying back and forth with the airplane of the Secretary of the Interior, negotiating the movements. So they're well organized. They are sometimes armed, and they have a long tradition of resistance. Also, it should be mentioned that Oaxaca is the, how would I call it? The womb of the agrarian reform. Benito Juárez, the former president, was born there. He led the agrarian reform. He removed the land from the church and actually initiated the process for the agrarian distribution that was completed with the revolution. So agrarian issues are a very strong cultural topic in the state of Oaxaca. Let's go ahead, because I think I have 25 minutes and I think I'm very short of time. How am I doing?
Maybe 5 or 10 more.
Woo, jeez. Okay, here are the locations for the wind farms. The project staging is outdated precisely, as I said, because I have a dire need for updated information. So let's see. Villosho is I think it's in the blue line. Am I right, Lourdes? That polygon? Exactly, but by the San Dionisio del Mar. Well, never mind, because they haven't, they're not identified. But one of the problems with Villosho is that the fisheries of San Dionisio del Mar complained that the works were not letting free routing for the transportation of their fish. So when they say, well, we're paying you fair price for your land, then another issue popped up, that it was that they didn't have free transit for the delivery of their fish. And then they said, they popped up with another issue saying that the wind was a public asset and that it could not be privatized. And then they popped up with another issue saying that wind farms were noisy, that they took up too much space, and they were frightening their animals. And from there on, any other argument was put forward before the NGOs and the courts. But this problem began, I should mention, before the energy reform. And I remember when I went to see Lourdes, because I wanted to write this paper, which was published right before the first previous consultation, she was already thinking about how to solve this, and she acknowledged two very important things. One, that Mexico had been a party to the Agreement 169 of the International Labor Organization, which obligates the Mexican state to perform indigenous consultation. And international treaties concerning human rights are regarded as constitutional law in Mexico. And that had been evaded. And the second thing that she acknowledged that was very sound is that the constitutional change law, which is called amparo in Mexico, had been modified in the sense that you don't have to be a directly affected party in order to challenge a project. We have in Mexico what's called the interés legítimo, which is legitimate standing. So if I live in Mexico City and I'm animus to a pipeline in Hidalgo or a wind farm in Oaxaca, I can challenge the project. Now, the courts have been very conservative in admitting those challenges, but it's in the law, and justices change. There will be two justices that will leave the Supreme Court in a number of years, and some others might admit a legal challenge that says, well, someone in Germany is opposing a wind farm in Oaxaca, and admit the challenge. It can get as ridiculous as that because the law is very, very general. So the consultation had to happen because things were getting really ugly. I mean, people in the construction, indigenous people in the construction site were expelling and physically fighting the construction workers, and then at the same time, the company workers began to use force to complete the works. So it got really ugly. Thus, the consultation occurred. It was accepted. The project is currently under how do you say that? It's running, it's delivering electricity, but another constitutional challenge has been filed. What have they argued? Right to the land, territory, and natural resources. Right to free and informed consent, which in my view has been obtained, but they say otherwise. Right to previous free and informed consultation. What's different from point 2 to point 3? This is consent. The other thing is consultation. Because it's not clear in the law whether consultation requires consent. You could argue, well, we consulted. That's the obligation. But the law does not explicitly state that you need consent. Right to the free determination of indigenous nations. And God knows what that means. And point number 4 of the suit is right to a healthy environment. And these points are going to have to be reviewed by the court, and we're waiting for the ruling who knows when, because the court doesn't have a statute of limitation. It might be in 2 months, it might be in 3, it might be in 2 years, it might be in 5. But these precedents are very important because they give legal certainties about how far indigenous communities can go and how far they cannot. And I hope they come up with it soon because I need to finish this research. Okay, these are my preliminary conclusions and recommendations. First of all, most problems cannot be simplified to a single reason or source, and that's answering Jose Maria's question. My preliminary insights is that one of the main reasons these things happen are lack of institutional development, overlapping rights, unfeasible guarantees from a government eager to attract investment. You go to the Secretary of Energy in La Colonia del Valle, and they guarantee that your investment is safe, that nothing will occur, but projects do not occur in Eje 5 and Insurgentes. And I must say that in some cases, poor company outreach to help people understand the benefits of their projects, if any. And that was a big complaint in Villosho. It's like, why should we let this happen to us? What are we going to get from this? And point number 2, there cannot be an overarching strategy to deal with individuals or communities in Mexico. Due to its cultural complexity, every region should be analyzed separately. You cannot compare people in Yucatan and in Campeche, which are relatively peaceful states, with very proactive, politicized, and sometimes violent states such as Oaxaca and Guerrero and Veracruz and Tamaulipas. Another main observation that I have is Mexican energy policy is very centralized in the federal government. So people go to the federal government and they forget that they have local and municipal authorities that they have to deal with, because they feel that the federal government is king when it's not. And the little guys are the sources of the big nuisances many times. Acting rapidly can have a high cost. Identify the proper or conflicting leaderships. People like to go ahead and talk to one person or to 2 people in the community, and they forget that a community can have 10 people, or can have 500 people, or can have 5,000 people. And sometimes identifying leadership when you deal with 5,000 people can be very complex. Another recommendation is become engaged with local universities. They know their folks. I'm not saying that they're perfect. I'm not saying that they might provide exactly the right advice, but they're there and they know exactly where to look. They might not have the answer, but they might be able to pinpoint where the issues are. Do not try to reach hasty conclusions such as they want money. Never happens. They might want something else and then something else, and they might even say that they don't want money anymore. And also study and profile the justices in the Mexican Supreme Court, because they're the last legal recourse you have, and they're attracting many of the cases. And I think I have a few more. Profile governors, mayors, municipal authorities, and their political preferences. Oaxaca is magical. One day you have 500 municipalities, the next day you have 550 municipalities because they've become divided, and then the next day you have 400 municipalities because some united. So track that, because many of the permits that you'll need are from a municipal jurisdiction. And get assistance with agrarian law, because I think Chema mentioned, or 50% of the land is subject to agrarian law. My last INEGI consultation said that it was 75. Oh, Tony, he's gone. Good for him. It's 75% agrarian law if you add up ejido, and communal. And those are very complex laws, very complex, and there are very few specialists. And if everything goes wrong, drink mezcal. And if everything goes right, drink mezcal. That's a Oaxaca saying. Para todo bien, mezcal. Y para todo mal, también. Okay, thank you very much. And these are my final recommendations. Keep calm, we're Mexicans. Keep calm, drink mezcal. Keep calm, sereno moreno. And keep calm, ahorita le atiendo. I'll be with you shortly. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Miriam. Let's go right into our discussants' remarks. So Owen, if you want to lead us off.
Thank you. My assignment is to talk about legal matters, and that's what I'm mostly going to do. But I want to begin, first of all, with the last recommendation you made about drinking mezcal. I completely agree with that, provided it's in provided it's in reasonable quantities. But I also want to make just a brief comment about the upcoming elections, which I understand it's still very speculative. But I just want to say that I think I'm a little less optimistic than some of the other speakers are about what might happen if Obrador gets elected, especially with regard to the issue we're talking about, which is indigenous peoples. Because while he may have toned down his rhetoric in many circles, when he goes out to talk to indigenous peoples, he's fond of calling the government and investors filthy pigs and hogs and swine, okay? And the indigenous populations are fond of calling him their rooster, okay? Now, I don't think this is healthy rhetoric when we're talking about the problems that Miriam just discussed, okay? The other thing is if those of you who are interested in the hydrocarbon area, and that's really my area, I can't speak very much about wind directly, although I must note that this is the first time I've ever heard wind farms referred to as wind parks. Is that a new...
What farm?
Wind farms referred to as... Well, you called it wind farms, but earlier the prior panel, several people talked about wind park. And yeah, and I find that... I was just wondering if it's a new politically correct way of referring to wind developments. But anyway...
Spanglish.
The... If you need a little insight in, what might happen in the hydrocarbon area, a very recent development, just June 1, just a week ago, there was legislation proposed by the Morena Coalition, who is one of the big backers of Obrador. The bill is talking largely about fiscal matters, none of which are happy from an investor standpoint, okay? But just to let you know that, I'm not as optimistic as some of the other speakers are. I also would just point out that from the perspective of investors, okay, perception is reality, okay. And I was just speaking with a very prominent lawyer here in Houston last week. I'm going to operate under Chatham House rules, so I'm not going to tell you who it was, but about the Obrador election. And afterwards, he sent me an email. And I'm just going to quote from it. It's not very long. It's longer, but I'm just going to edit out a couple things. Mexico needs to send clear signals to investors about protection of their investment. The election of Obrador would send an extremely negative signal. Obrador means the end of the Mexican energy initiative, full stop. Any reasonable investor should run for the exit. Okay. Well, I just said I'm not going to tell you, but a very prominent lawyer who advises a lot of investors, lawyer here in Houston, advises a lot of oil and gas investors. So, I mean, he's got a very negative view of this whole thing. Now, another item of interest, I think, is that just about 1 week ago, New Mexico did negotiate a new European trade agreement. And it gives you some insights, I think, into what particularly the dispute resolution reforms are going to do. And they're going to try and address some of the problems. Well, they do address some of the problems and some of the criticisms that have been made about the prior dispute resolution processes, particularly in ICSID. And the European Trade Agreement refers to those to the ICSID procedure and then makes some changes in it. Now, ICSID, of course, has been signed now by Mexico, but has to be ratified by the Senate. I don't know what the current status of that effort is, but some of that, I think, is a response to the Obrador candidacy. It's also, I think, largely a response to the Trump effort to try and reform NAFTA, because Mexico probably is better off with some of the ICSID procedures than they would be better off with what Trump is proposing. And I think it also suggests that, Mexico is trying to be responsive to the upcoming election of Obrador, assuming that he is elected. Now, Jose mentioned the social impact assessment rules that just came down again 1 week ago. Everything happens in 1 week ago, I guess. But they're pretty extensive. There are different ones for the hydrocarbon sector and different ones for the electricity sector. But typical of what governments do, and it's kind of a reality. It's not really intended to be a criticism, but under the international ILO convention and the rules, and also just what governments tend to do as a general proposition, is they take responsibility for things. Clearly, the government is responsible for making sure that the ILO requirements are being met, but they pass that responsibility off to the investor in ways that require the investor to really justify what's going on, and it becomes a condition for getting approvals. Okay, so that's true in both the hydrocarbon and the electricity sector. Well, I'm supposed to talk about legal matters, so what does a lawyer do? You run off and you look at the contract to start with, okay? I'm not going to spend too much time about it because I don't think the contracts in Mexico offer the investor much hope, okay? If you have a confiscation, sure, then you can go and get compensation. But if you want to try and move forward with your project, this is what I'm really concerned about, okay? Well, one of the first things you look at when you are anticipating a possible delay or a serious problem is you go to look at the force majeure provisions, okay? Well, I studied the force majeure provisions of the Mexican contracts that I have available to me. I don't have all of them available to me. I don't see much in the force majeure clause that would help in trying to deal with a delay involving trying to get consent or at least consultation from indigenous communities, okay? And frankly, I see a lot more problems in the contract with regard to that. So for example, and Jose and I talked about this very briefly at the break, the onus is on the investor to deal with the indigenous populations and comply with these new regulations. Well, take a typical Mexican contract, okay, hydrocarbon contract. You're not going to do anything till you've won the bid round because you don't want to spend a lot of money when you don't know if you're going to get the bid, okay? Moreover, if you happen to have a production sharing contract or a risk service contract where you have cost recovery, you're not going to get cost recovery on anything that's not approved by the government, see? So you get the contract. Under one contract, and I think it's fairly typical, you have 45 days to propose a exploration plan, okay? You have 3 years to explore, the 45 days plus whatever it takes for the government to approve it, which I think it's 90 days. I'm not sure about that, but it's all part of the 3 years, okay? Well, you're also not supposed to conduct any activities under the ILO procedures until you have consulted, because it's free, prior, and informed consultation or consent, depending on how you want to cut that issue. So you have to do all this consulting before you set one foot on the property. See, this includes determining who the indigenous populations are, identifying their leadership, hiring translators as necessary to talk to them in their native language, okay? Don't think that you can come in, I think Dr. Megler used the great term about coming in with high heels, a short skirt, and low cleavage. Well, my thought was don't come in with a glossy brochure and hold a public meeting and think that that's going to be enough, okay? That's clearly not going to be enough, okay? So this is going to take time. Meanwhile, your clock is ticking, see? Now, you can get your 3-year exploration period extended by a year and then by another year, but only if you have completed all of your minimum work obligations, okay? Moreover, the Mexican contracts say that it is your burden to acquire all rights of way and easements and land use permissions, okay? So right then and there, that suggests to me that there's got to be some consent, okay, from the communities that have these communal rights or these ejido rights, or it could be private ownership rights, for you to get that access. And that's all going to take time, and it's going to cost you money. And when you look at the federal court decisions, particularly the Amparo decision, and I have to rely on translations. Well, I apologize to everybody for that, but I don't read Spanish. That's where I think you get this language that suggests that consent might be required, not just consultation, okay? But it also suggests, to me at least, that when you go to compensate whomever, the indigenous populations in this example, it's not just that you pay market value. That's a given, okay? But also that you pay value based upon the kind of the more or less the profitability of your project. See? So in other words, it's you have to take into account the money that you're going to make, because that's a factor in what benefits you have to provide to the indigenous populations. And so this requires a lot of transparency. And a lot of oil investors are going to be highly reluctant to share that kind of information. And yet, an argument can be made, at least, that that's probably going to be necessary to meet the informed requirement. I want you to keep in mind, free means, without pressure or manipulation. Informed means the tribe or the indigenous population, whatever the case may be, has got the information they need in order to make not only an evaluation of the impacts of the project, but also an evaluation of the benefits they're supposed to get from the project, okay? And then the C is the consent, or possibly just a consultation, but I really think that we're looking more at consent, in at least as a practical matter. Now, a couple things that I haven't mentioned so far, but it was mentioned by the prior panel, is the corruption question, okay? Well, from the point of view of the investor, I think what you have to be careful of is that, and the law on this is far from clear, okay? But when you're dealing with an indigenous population and you're dealing with the leaders of these populations to try and come up with a social project or a compensation project, keep in mind that the very people that you're dealing with may be regarded as a public official for purposes of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, so you have to be very careful about the compensation factor, okay? Because you could find yourself in trouble not only domestically in Mexico, perhaps, under their local bribery laws, but also under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And trust me, that's something that you don't want to, that's a problem you don't want to have. Let me quickly conclude that, you know, I think Mexico needs to consider and that IOCs shop the world for investment opportunities, okay? And they care about really three things. It's really quite simple. And again, I can't talk about wind farms, but an oil investor, they look at the geology. And if it's favorable, they're interested. If it's not, they're not interested, okay? Then they look at the fiscal terms, and if they think they can make a profit, they continue to be interested. But if they don't think they can make a profit, they're not interested, okay? And then they look at the surface risk, which is the legal risk and all of the other risks, including indigenous peoples' risk, that we talk about. And that acts kind of as a brake. You know, I mean, I always kind of tell my law students when I teach international petroleum law that lawyers in the petroleum companies are kind of like the skunk at the picnic. Because, you know, the geology is favorable and the fiscal terms are favorable and we're just going to ready to plow ahead. And then the lawyer comes in and tries to put a brake on everything, saying, you know, the surface risk is really too great. You know, happily probably for investors, they oftentimes ignore their lawyer's advice. But, you know, that's kind of what lawyers do. We're kind of paid to worry. And so I think the surface risk issue is a critical one, and I agree with what the prior panel said too about, you know, water being an issue and security being an issue. Okay, water and security are an issue in the Permian, and I don't. It'd be nice if Professor Taylor had time to comment on the project she's involved in out in the Permian. But you know, we don't think about. Well, you understand water is an issue in the Permian, West Texas, but you think security? Most of the companies have got paid security and investigators to investigate thefts of oil equipment in the oil patch. It's not the problem that it is in Mexico, but it's a problem. I would never, in conclusion, don't want to tell Mexico what to do. Okay, so please don't interpret my comments about Mexico should do this or do that. All I'm trying to do is kind of react based on what Mexico has done. And I do want to say that I think Mexico reforms have just been amazing. I mean, I can't imagine, I don't think there's another country in the world that has announced reforms and implemented them as fast as Mexico has done. Maybe it's been too fast. I guess we're going to find that out in the next election. But I really am a real admirer of what Mexico has done. All I can do is just comment kind of from what I hope would be kind of an investor's take. In other contexts, I could comment on from a government take, but here I'm kind of making a comment from the investor's take. Because, you know, ILC shop the world, and if they get disenchanted with Mexico, they will go elsewhere. Like historically they did, and it's kind of ironic, you know, they left Mexico in the 1920s for what they thought were happier grounds, Venezuela, which really seems ironic today, okay? But that's what happened, okay? And what was all of that about? What was the Mexican Revolution about? Land reform. And what are we talking about here today but land issues in the context of indigenous peoples? Well, Anika? Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. It's certainly a great opportunity, first of all, because I want to thank the Baker Institute because I have been invited to become one of their non-resident fellows after a long career precisely in this oil and gas business, which has been very exciting to be in, and particularly Mexico, despite these very rather negative messages we have been hearing today. I have to tell you the opposite. Mexico, it was really a great experience. Personally, however, it was also a lot of hard work. And I think that that's something that I want to emphasize in my comments today, is that it requires the right approach to a country that has made this big reform that, as Owen said, literally there is no precedent that other country has done, something, a reform of this magnitude in this amount of time, where you have now more than 100 contracts already having been executed, and they're in the process of actually, some of these contracts have already producing. Despite that they are very small contracts, it's the beginning of a new era for Mexico. And when the company I used to work for, Chevron and others, left in the 38 was not because they wanted to leave, because there is no question that Mexico has the geology, so they were nationalized. It was it was a completely different situation. What is going to happen now, we don't know. The elections are next month. However, I think that this new institutional framework that has been put in place, it has the fortitude, I would say, to survive whatever will happen, because it will take significant amount of changes in the governors and in the Congress to actually reverse the constitutional changes that were made when this reform was made. One of the elements that I really want to highlight is because I was being part of this process pretty much from the beginning of the reform. I was working in Mexico. It has been the fact that the government was willing to listen to the industry and to look for the best practices. And the contracts, despite that, of course, depending on the situation, people may have different views, but the reality is, as I said, more than 100 contracts have been signed, and they are in the process of have become operational. But at the same time, in this environment, one of the elements that have to do with social impact is the fact that the industry practice is to have the environmental and social impact assessment as one effort together. Obviously, that requires having the expertise to do these two elements of the analysis, the environmental and the social impact, because they are very much coming together, as we have been hearing today. However, given the complexities, I'm pretty sure in Mexico, they decided to keep them separate. So, as we have been hearing in this particular panel, is being focused on the social impact. And from my perspective, one of the key elements that I want to emphasize is the fact that to be successful, you really have to have a very strong stakeholder engagement. You really have to, and as I said, there have been several comments regarding companies or people who want to do this in a very light manner. That's not the case. Mexico, as Undersecretary Energy, Dr. Melgar said earlier, is a very complex society. And it has many different groups, many different ethnicities. It's a very rich country, culturally speaking, has a long history, has thousands of years of history with the Mayan culture. The indigenous population are very important. So it is a very complex country. Therefore, the time that companies have to spend looking at the situation where they are going to operate is critical, because otherwise they are not going to succeed. And if if the company decides to do it fast, as somebody had mentioned, to do it fast is not the right approach, because you really need to spend the time to understand what are the drivers, what are the values, what are the needs of the people that you are going to affect or you're going to have an impact on with your project. I had a very interesting personal experience that I want to share with you in terms of this stakeholder engagement. In 2015, under the leadership of Dr. Melgar, there was the interest of Mexico joining the EITI, this Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. At the time, I was member of I was board member of the Association of Mexican Companies, EMP companies, and I was asked to be the representative of the EMP companies in this effort. EITI, as we mentioned earlier, the objective is to really keep track of the revenues that the host country and the companies can be, all the revenues that are exchanged can be tracked and are visible for the population at large. Well, that requires, actually, to become a member of EITI, it requires that the government, the companies, and the civil society agree on a plan of action to actually join and to become members of this organization. So you can imagine the complexity of Mexico trying to get the support of the civil society to be part of this group. Well, it took quite a bit of work in terms of having many, many meetings. First of all, identify who these are the right representatives, NGOs, academia, and we work with them to actually make sure that these groups were going to be part of this process. And this started, as I said, in 2015. By the end of 2016, by November, we signed the agreement that actually included a simultaneous signature of the representatives of the community that were part of this, had been selected by the community to be part of this process, the government and the companies, meaning the EMP companies and the mining companies. And actually, Mexico was accepted as the membership of Mexico was accepted in October last year. So this was about 2 years, nearly 3 years process, but a successful process because the time needed to get this done was spent, and the work with the key members of the society was done properly. So as I said, it's not an easy process, but so I'm confident that the companies, when they are getting through they get a block, it's online or it's offshore, and they have to do this social impact assessment, they really have to focus on identifying the members of the community at the state level and at the municipal level. In my case, despite everything that has been said here as well about corruption, I have to tell you that I was never, as the general director of Chevron in Mexico, I was never approached in any possible way that for a bribe or anything like that. So it happens, I know it happens, but I personally was never approached with any request of that type. So as I said, I think it takes the determination to work, and at the same time is to have a positive attitude. That at least I believe that is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. And Yeah, we can certainly applaud for Benigna. Yes, so Michelle, we have just a few minutes. I'm so sorry. We're kind of up against our 12:30 deadline, but please make
Well,
some
let me
remarks.
let me just try to draw some things together, and then we might be able to go a few minutes later.
Yeah, I think
Francisco, perhaps a little bit. We'll see. But let me well, first of all, let me thank all of our colleagues at Rice for working with us on this, and all of my crew from Austin, my colleagues, for making the trek down here. And just try to close up. I have 5 quick points to make about this. And I just need to provide a bit of context. Over the years, I've worked in about 20 different countries, a lot on technical assistance grants, often paid for by U.S. government in some form, USAID, Department of State, other things like that. And I've also spent in my career a lot of time in the heartland here. That's a useful word to think about, actually. In the Rocky Mountains, on the Gulf Coast, Appalachia, on energy projects and infrastructure. So I'm not sure that I entirely agree with my pal Miriam. By the way, Miriam is the feeling person in the partnership. I'm Spock. We established this a long time ago. I want people to be reasonable, and I'm really trying hard to help people get over all of their cognitive biases, but you know, this is a lifetime, in my own family even, this is a lifetime thing. I think there are, the solutions I don't think are the same, but I think that there are some things that drive the problems in common ways. And one of the ones that I worry about a lot, and there's nothing we can do about it, geography is destiny. When you look at where people go for projects, it's not in the middle of cities. We did that briefly in the evolution of the Barnett, drilling in Fort Worth neighborhoods. But most of the time, operators and investors are out where the resources are, which means a lot of right-of-way for infrastructure to get the resources to market. And that drives a lot of the sensitivities, especially if the projects are destined to be export projects. And in the case of most of these situations, it's not the local community that's going to use the resources. It's way more than anybody can absorb, right? Even at the state or provincial level, it's destined for global markets in the most part, or the national economies in the least. And that sets how people feel about things to a large degree. The second thing, to Francisco's point, and one that another battle I've fought a lot over the years, it is not just an extractive industries problem, but it's so easy to point the finger and say, oh, this is the source of all evil. It's driven things like EITI over the years and everything associated with it, Publish What You Pay, Revenue Watch, every other invention, NGO invention out there. I'm glad to see the attention on renewables. I support Miriam fully on that. We aren't scrutinizing that part of the energy space enough. But look at California and what's going on in that state related to information technology industry development. The extreme differences in income, the disruptions in infrastructure, affordable housing, and other things, the problems are the same. The solutions are going to be different, but the capture of rents, the acceleration and the trajectory of economic rent creation associated with industries anywhere can cause a problem and cause dislocation. So I just want to put that on the table. The third point, listening to Lourdes and Benigna and I, you know, in our conversations over the years, looking at Mexico. In the US and Canada, regulation and oversight of energy businesses is old, and it's at the state and provincial level. The federal government came along a lot later, and usually when the states and the provincial governments couldn't agree. In Mexico, the federal government is creating the institutions, and the states are not. And I think it's wonderful to put people on buses and send them to localities. What I wonder about is how on earth you're going to get people in place in the states with reasonable institutions at the state level and engagement to be able to execute the way you really need to execute. And that's my biggest thing that I think can be fixed, but it is a long capacity building curve. And Miriam and I saw this up front during the State Department grant the past 2 years. The third thing on external interests, I ran an LNG research consortium. A lot of people here were involved in one way or another for about 10 years. And at the end of that thing, I decided that we should do something that we should have done at the beginning. We did 20 case studies on LNG projects in the US and Canada, trying to figure out how on earth things ended up where they were, because some just spiraled out of control. The original ideas that investors had were never able to be executed on. In every single case, what we found were two things that happened. One was the arrival of external interests, showing up in the host community to stir things up. And it's democracy, you know, it's freedom of interaction and all of that. But if you don't expect that to happen and you don't understand why it happens, then you can't be prepared to engage or achieve consultation or consent or anything. And this is a really large problem. Related to that is what the operators do in response. And so, as I cautioned already one person, a couple of people today, it's a really slippery slope. When the operators start trying to mitigate by promising to create economic benefits, boy, that is dangerous ground for the investors and for the political jurisdictions. And I've seen this directly in my career over the years, especially in places like the Rocky Mountains and Appalachia. This is trying to find economic benefits around shale oil and gas development in a place like West Virginia, where I was this week. Let me tell you, this is tough stuff. But to make promises to communities in cyclical industries is very, 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 a very tenuous thing to do. So I would caution against that. The final thing, a key point that Miriam made that we really have to think more about. Who benefits from what? Right. This comment that you made about spiritual, how did you put it? The spiritual development as opposed to economic development. How many projects have we been dealing with in the past years have headed that way, whether it's our Dakota Access or KXL or what's going on in Mexico or anything that we've ever had to deal with in Alaska or any of these places in our countries. Somewhere along the line, at one point, we actually had processes for national interest determination. That's something that Owen and I can go back and think about, having looked at the evolution of interstate commerce in the United States and in Canada over the years. The drivers for those things, the idea was you're building the national economy. You're connecting markets. So the interstate highway system, interstate pipelines, the ability to be able to get things done, to be able to execute, to put resources into the economy, activity in the Gulf of Mexico, drilling activity in the Gulf of Mexico. This is not for the state of Louisiana or Texas. This is for the United States. Sure, it has peculiar benefits for the communities and the companies, but it's a national effort. Somewhere along the way, and perhaps it was with the ILO, perhaps it was, with all of the stuff that's happened over the years, we've lost that sense. While we've been working on this seminar, Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada stepped into Trans Mountain and is taking over the project from KM. Connor, I would argue that is like way stronger than trying to figure out how to salvage the nuclear and coal businesses in the United States. You now have a direct nationalization of an infrastructure project that can't get done because of the combination of provincial opposition, external interest group opposition, which is huge in British Columbia, indigenous people acting on their own and also getting captured, and an inability for everybody to figure out how to get a crucial project done to move Canadian oil production into the global market. And that's really something to think about. And so, if we have to rethink how people accept things, and boy, that's a really big job, how to educate ourselves again or re-educate ourselves, being aware of all the things that people feel, but knowing that at the end, we simply can't function. As Lourdes said, we'll get no project anywhere, and what good does that do us? Mm-hmm. So those are my quick observations on all of this, and we'll see, whether y'all want to stay, go, or whatever. But thank you again. Thanks, Melinda, for stepping in and facilitating, and thanks to all of you for listening today.
And I have been told by my good friend Francisco that we have to vacate this room and move on to lunch, so we do not have time for questions or discussion, unfortunately. I, for one, have a number of questions for each of you, and I'm sure that all of you do as well. But we want to thank you again for coming today. Thank you to the to the Baker Institute for hosting us here at Rice, and I hope everybody has a terrific afternoon. So thank you.